Welcome to the Humanized Books channel. Today, summary mini-book is based on The Courage to be Disliked, the Japanese phenomenon that shows you how to change your life and achieve real happiness, by Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Koga. What if the reason you're unhappy isn't your past, your personality, or other people? What if it's something simpler and harder to accept? This book begins with a young man who believes his life is controlled by trauma, comparison, and fear of being disliked, and a philosopher who tells him something unsettling: you are free, right now. And that freedom is exactly what scares you. The courage to be disliked isn't about becoming confident or positive. It's about giving up excuses, letting go of approval, and choosing how to live, even if others don't like it. These ideas aren't comfortable, but they might change how you see yourself, your relationships, and happiness itself. Let's begin. Introduction. A dialogue about freedom, courage, and happiness. This book unfolds as a quiet but intense conversation over several nights between two people who see life very differently. One is a youth, restless, intelligent, and deeply dissatisfied. He feels trapped by his past, wounded by comparison, and convinced that happiness belongs to others. The other is a philosopher, calm and precise, who insists on a radical idea: that the world is simple, that people can change, and that happiness is available to anyone who has the courage to choose it. What follows is not self-help in the usual sense. There are no techniques, no affirmations, no promises of quick transformation. Instead, the dialogue explores a psychological philosophy that overturns common assumptions about trauma, personality, relationships, and freedom. The philosopher challenges the youth again and again, not to comfort him, but to free him. Each chapter strips away another belief the youth clings to: that the past controls the present, that emotions overpower choice, that recognition from others is necessary, that being special is the goal of life. This mini-book preserves the spirit of that dialogue. It is meant to be listened to slowly. The ideas may feel uncomfortable at first. That discomfort is intentional. As the philosopher says, this is not gentle medicine, it is strong medicine. Chapter 1. The First Night. Deny Trauma. The book opens with a sharp tension between two worldviews. The youth arrives convinced that life is heavy, unfair, and largely predetermined. He believes that people are shaped by their past experiences, especially painful ones, and that these experiences explain why some people cannot change. From his perspective, suffering is proof that freedom is limited. The philosopher takes the opposite stance from the very beginning. He insists that the world is far simpler than the youth believes, and that this simplicity is not cruel but liberating. According to him, people are not controlled by their past. What controls them is how they interpret their past in the present. The most shocking claim introduced in this chapter is the denial of trauma as a causal force. The philosopher does not deny that painful events happen or that people suffer. What he rejects is the idea that past events determine present behavior. In his view, this belief traps people in helplessness. If the past controls the present, then change becomes impossible. Instead, the philosopher introduces a central idea of Adlerian psychology. People are not driven by causes, but by goals. Human behavior always serves a purpose, even when that behavior looks irrational or self-destructive. Anxiety, withdrawal, anger, and sadness are not uncontrollable reactions. They are tools the person uses, often unconsciously, to achieve a goal in the present. The youth strongly resists this idea. He feels it sounds like blaming people for their suffering. But the philosopher reframes responsibility as freedom. If emotions truly controlled us, then we would never be responsible for our actions. But because behavior serves a goal, it can be changed once the goal is recognized. A powerful example discussed in this chapter is the case of a person who refuses to leave their room. The youth sees this as proof of trauma and fear. The philosopher sees it differently. Staying in the room protects the person from rejection, failure, and judgment. Anxiety is real, but it is being used to avoid something perceived as worse. This leads to another uncomfortable conclusion. Unhappiness is often chosen, not consciously, and not because people enjoy it, but because it feels safer than the unknown alternative. Remaining unhappy can preserve relationships, attract attention, or justify inaction. Happiness, by contrast, demands risk. The youth feels destabilized by this idea. It removes excuses, but it also removes comfort. The philosopher makes it clear that this psychology offers no sympathy for victimhood, but immense respect for human agency. If you are not bound by the past, then your life is decided here and now. The chapter closes with a defining theme of the book. What prevents people from changing is not lack of ability, intelligence, or opportunity. It is lack of courage. Courage to give up familiar suffering. Courage to stop blaming the past. Courage to choose happiness without guarantees. Chapter 2. The second night, all problems are interpersonal relationship problems. In the second chapter, the philosopher pushes the discussion away from the individual and toward relationships. The youth believes his suffering comes from internal flaws, low self-esteem, lack of talent, emotional weakness. He sees his problems as personal and psychological. The philosopher challenges this directly and introduces a radical claim. Every problem in life is a problem of interpersonal relationships. This idea immediately unsettles the youth. He argues that many struggles happen alone. Anxiety, depression, loneliness, and fear feel deeply personal. The philosopher does not deny the feelings. What he questions is their origin. According to him, these feelings always arise in relation to others, even when no one is physically present. The philosopher explains that human beings are social creatures. We define ourselves through comparison, evaluation, and belonging. Even when we are alone, we are imagining others, how we are seen, judged, ranked, or ignored. A person living alone on an island would not suffer from inferiority or loneliness in the same way, because there would be no one to compare themselves to. From this perspective, feelings of inferiority are not objective truths about the self. They are relational judgments. The youth believes he is inferior because he measures himself against others and finds himself lacking. The philosopher reframes this. Inferiority feelings are not problems in themselves. They only become destructive when they turn into an inferiority complex. An inferiority complex is not the belief that one is lacking. It is the belief that one must not try because one is lacking. The philosopher emphasizes that this belief is a convenient excuse. By declaring oneself inferior, one avoids the risk of effort, failure, and responsibility. The youth resist this idea, feeling it sounds harsh. But the philosopher insists that excuses often disguise themselves as self-criticism. The discussion then turns to superiority. The youth assumes superiority is the opposite of inferiority. The philosopher disagrees. He explains that superiority complexes are often just another expression of inferiority. People who boast, dominate, or seek recognition are often trying to escape feelings of smallness by placing themselves above others. At the core of both inferiority and superiority lies comparison. The philosopher identifies comparison as a major source of suffering. Life, he argues, is not a competition. There is no universal ranking of human value. When people turn life into a race, someone must always lose, and anxiety becomes inevitable. The youth struggles with this. He feels that society is built on competition and evaluation. The philosopher does not deny this reality, but he insists that one does not need to internalize it. One can choose to live without constantly measuring oneself against others. This leads to an important clarification. Adlerian psychology does not aim to eliminate feelings of inferiority. It aims to redirect them. Inferiority can motivate growth when it is not tied to comparison. Improving oneself for one's own sake is different from improving oneself to win against others. The chapter also introduces the idea of life tasks, which are always relational. Work, friendship, and love are not solitary challenges. They require cooperation rather than competition. When people struggle in these areas, it is often because they approach relationships as battlegrounds for approval or dominance. The philosopher concludes the chapter by returning to freedom. If suffering comes from relationships, then it also means relationships are where freedom exists. One cannot change others, but one can change how one participates in relationships. By giving up comparison and the need to win, a person can step out of constant conflict. For the youth, this realization is unsettling but revealing. His unhappiness is not proof that he is broken. It is evidence that he is locked in silent competitions he never agreed to consciously. To live freely, he must first abandon the idea that life is something to be won. Chapter 3. The third night, discard other people's tasks. In the third chapter, the philosopher introduces one of the most practical and unsettling ideas in the book, task separation. The youth believes his unhappiness comes from failing expectations. He worries about disappointing others, being disliked, and not meeting social standards. The philosopher argues that this suffering comes from taking on tasks that do not belong to him. The core principle is simple but difficult to accept. In any situation, we must ask, whose task is this? Responsibility ends where another person's choices begin. When we try to control how others think, feel, or judge us, we step into territory that is not ours. The youth struggles with this immediately. He feels that caring about others naturally means trying to satisfy them. The philosopher disagrees. Caring does not mean control. Trying to manage other people's reactions leads to anxiety, resentment, and manipulation. True respect for others means allowing them to think and feel as they choose. The philosopher explains that many conflicts arise because people blur the boundaries between tasks. A person may work sincerely, but whether others praise or criticize that work is their task, not yours. A parent may offer guidance, but whether a child follows, it is the child's task. Confusing these boundaries leads to anger on both sides. The youth worries that discarding other people's tasks sounds cold or selfish. The philosopher reframes it as courage. When you stop living for approval, you risk being disliked. But this risk is unavoidable if you want to live freely. A life governed by the desire to be liked is a life constantly controlled by others. This leads to a critical insight. Freedom requires the courage to be disliked. The youth begins to see that many of his choices are shaped by fear of rejection. He avoids speaking honestly, taking initiative, or setting boundaries because he wants to maintain harmony. The philosopher points out that this harmony is false. It is maintained through self-suppression. The chapter also addresses anger and intervention. When someone interferes aggressively in another person's life, it often appears caring. In reality, it is usually an attempt to control. True support respects autonomy. It offers help without imposing outcomes. The philosopher emphasizes that discarding other people's tasks does not mean abandoning relationships. It means clarifying them. When each person handles their own tasks, relationships become lighter and more honest. People can cooperate instead of controlling one another. The youth begins to understand that many of his relationships are built on silent contracts. He behaves in certain ways in exchange for approval. Discarding other people's tasks breaks these contracts. This is frightening because it removes guarantees, but it also removes resentment. The chapter closes with a powerful shift in perspective. Living for others' expectations is not kindness. It is self-betrayal. And it teaches others to rely on control rather than trust. By focusing only on one's own tasks, a person can finally act sincerely. The philosopher leaves the youth with a difficult but liberating truth. You cannot choose to be liked. You can only choose to live honestly. Being disliked is not proof of failure. It is often proof that you are finally free. Chapter 4. The Fourth Night, Where the Center of the World Is. In the fourth chapter, the philosopher shifts the conversation from boundaries to orientation. The youth has begun to accept task separation and the courage to be disliked, but he now feels lost. If he is no longer living for approval or comparison, then what should guide his life? The philosopher answers by questioning where the youth believes the center of the world lies. The youth realizes that, until now, he has placed himself at the center. His worries revolve around how he appears, how he is judged, and whether he is valued. Even his suffering has been self-focused. The philosopher explains that this is not selfishness in a moral sense, but self-centeredness in a psychological sense. When a person is preoccupied with the self, even negative thoughts become a form of self-absorption. The philosopher introduces the idea of contribution. True happiness, he argues, does not come from being recognized or praised. It comes from the feeling that one is useful to others. This usefulness does not require exceptional talent or social status. It requires participation. The youth initially resists this idea. He feels that contribution sounds like another demand, another obligation. The philosopher clarifies that contribution is not sacrifice. It is not about self-denial or martyrdom. It is about shifting attention away from evaluation and toward engagement. When people feel they contribute, they stop asking whether they are liked. They stop obsessing over their rank. Their sense of worth becomes internal rather than dependent. The philosopher explains that this feeling of contribution is what Adler called community feeling, a sense of belonging that does not rely on competition. The youth begins to see that his loneliness is not caused by isolation alone, but by his constant focus on how he is perceived. Even in groups, he felt alone because he was measuring himself. By moving the center of the world outward, toward others, this loneliness can soften. The chapter also addresses self-sacrifice. The philosopher is careful to distinguish contribution from self-erasure. Contribution must come from freedom. When people help others to gain approval, they remain trapped in other people's tasks. Genuine contribution has no expectation of reward. This idea reframes work, friendship, and love. Work becomes meaningful not because it brings praise, but because it serves. Friendship becomes lighter when it is not a transaction. Love becomes possible when it is no longer a test of worth. The youth realizes that placing himself at the center made every interaction heavy. Each encounter carried the burden of proving value. Shifting the center outward does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes the direction of attention. Life becomes less about self-protection and more about participation. The philosopher emphasizes that community feeling is not about blending in or losing individuality. It is about standing as oneself while cooperating with others. Individuality grows stronger, not weaker, when it is no longer defined by opposition. The chapter closes with a quiet but profound insight. Happiness is not something achieved through introspection alone. It emerges when a person feels connected, useful, and oriented towards something beyond the self. When the center of the world moves outward, life begins to feel lighter. Chapter 5. The Fifth Night, Living in the Here and Now. In the final chapter, the philosopher addresses the youth's lingering anxiety about the future. Even after accepting task separation, contribution, and the courage to be disliked, the youth still feels uneasy. He worries about whether he is living correctly, whether his efforts will pay off, and whether happiness can truly last. The philosopher responds by challenging the very way the youth understands time and life. The youth believes life is a story moving toward a destination. Happiness, in this view, lies somewhere ahead, after success, after recognition, after becoming someone better. The philosopher calls this a dangerous illusion. Life is not a line toward a goal. It is a series of moments that can only be lived now. He explains that many people postpone living. They endure the present while imagining a future version of themselves who will finally be satisfied. But this future never arrives, because life is always happening in the present. When happiness is treated as a reward waiting at the end, it is permanently deferred. The philosopher introduces a key idea. Life is not a competition or a journey toward a finish line. It is a dance. A dance is not performed to arrive somewhere. It is complete in each movement. In the same way, life is not validated by outcomes, but by how fully one engages with each moment. The youth struggles with this. He feels that without goals, life becomes meaningless. The philosopher clarifies that goals are not the problem. Attachment to results is. When people live only for outcomes, they stop paying attention to the present. Effort becomes a burden instead of an expression of life. Living in the here and now does not mean abandoning responsibility or ambition. It means recognizing that the only place where courage, contribution, and choice exist is this moment. The past cannot be changed. The future cannot be controlled. Only the present can be lived. This perspective reframes happiness. Happiness is not a continuous emotional state. It is the sense of being fully engaged in one's chosen way of living. Even hardship can coexist with happiness when a person feels they are acting freely and sincerely. The philosopher returns to the theme of courage. To live in the present without guarantees requires bravery. There is no promise of recognition, success, or approval. One must act without knowing how others will respond or how life will unfold. The youth begins to see that his fear of the future was another way of avoiding responsibility in the present. Worrying feels active, but it changes nothing. Choosing how to live now, even imperfectly, is the only real action available. The chapter closes by redefining happiness one final time. Happiness is not being loved by everyone. It is not being special. It is not reaching a final state where nothing hurts. Happiness is the courage to live as oneself, in the present, contributing where one stands, without waiting for permission. With this realization, the conversation reaches its end. Nothing dramatic has changed in the youth's external circumstances, but his orientation toward life has shifted. The future no longer dominates him. The past no longer binds him. What remains is the quiet challenge of living here and now with courage. Reflective conclusion. The courage to be disliked offers a quiet but radical message. Happiness is not something granted by circumstances, approval, or the past. It is something chosen, moment by moment, through courage. The philosopher's ideas are unsettling because they remove familiar excuses. Trauma, comparison, and fear of judgment no longer explain why life feels stuck. Responsibility returns to the present through the youth's resistance and gradual understanding. The book shows that freedom begins when we stop living to satisfy others' expectations. By separating tasks, letting go of competition, and shifting our focus from being liked to contributing, relationships become lighter and more honest. Life stops being a performance and starts becoming participation. The final lesson is simple but demanding. Happiness is not waiting in the future, and it is not found by becoming special. It exists only in the present, when we choose to live sincerely as ourselves. That choice requires courage, and that courage, the book insists, is available to anyone right now. Thank you for listening. If this audiobook challenged how you think, support the work by subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts below. Comments shape future content. Stay curious, stay aware, and return for deeper explorations. All the best, and take care of yourselves.